Question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as of the opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary say no. Leader of Opposition.
Sir, I'd like to call for a division, please.
Would you like to record the dissent instead?
No, sir, I'd like to call for a division. Thank you.
The ayes have it. Would the honourable members who support the division please rise in their places? Right, clerk, ring the division bells. Sergeant at Arms, lock the doors. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. Leader of Opposition, you have claimed a division. Would you like to proceed with the division?
Yes, sir.
Take a division. The clerk will call the names of members to indicate their votes in the order based on the current sitting arrangement. When called upon, members are to stand up, raise your vote cards in my direction to indicate their votes. The clerk will repeat each member's vote for confirmation. If the vote read is not according to their vote indication, members should inform me immediately to have the correct vote recorded. The clerk will now proceed to record the votes.
Mr. S. Iswaran. Aye. Mr. Lawrence Wong. Aye. Mr. Teo Chee Hian, absent. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. Aye. Mr. K. Shanmugam. Aye. Mr. Chan Chun Sing. Aye. Mr. Masagos Zulkifli. Aye. Mr. Ong Yi Kang. Aye. Ms. Jessica Tan. Aye. Ms. Sim N. Aye. Dr. Amy Kaur, absent. Dr. Tan Si Leng. Aye. Mr. Desmond Lee, absent. Ms. Low Yen Ling. Aye. Ms. Sun Shui Ling. Aye. Ms. Gan Xiao Huang. Aye. Dr. Tan Wu Meng. Aye. Ms. Tin Pei Ling. Aye. Mr. Liang Eng Hua. Aye. Ms. Rahayu Mazam. Aye. Mr. Tan Kiat Hao. Aye. Mr. Bae Yam Keng. Aye. Mr. Eric Chua. Aye. Mr. Murali Pillay. Aye. Mr. Sito Yipin. Aye. Mr. Lim Biao Chuan. Aye. Mr. Darrell David. Aye. Ms. Joan Pereira. Aye. Mr. Louis Ng. Aye. Ms. Cheryl Chan. Aye. Ms. Indrani Raja. Aye. Mr. Gan Kim Yong, absent. Mr. Heng Swee Keat. Aye. Mr. Pritam Singh. No. Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, absent. Dr. Ng Eng Hen. Aye. Ms. Grace Fu, absent. Mrs. Josephine Teo, absent. Mr. Christopher D'Souza. Aye. Mr. Chee Hong Tat. Aye. Dr. Koh Poh Koon, absent. Dr. Malik Muhammad Maliki. Aye. Mr. Edwin Tong, absent. Mr. Zaki Mohammed. Aye. Mr. Heng Chi Hao. Aye. Dr. Janil Putticherry. Aye. Mr. Desmond Chu, aye. Mr. Muhammad Faisal Abdul Manap, no. Ms. Denise Phua, aye. Mr. Desmond Tan, aye. Associate Professor Dr. Muhammad Faisal Ibrahim, aye. Mr. Alvin Tan, aye. Mr. Sia Kian Peng, aye. Mr. Alex Yam, aye. Mr. Vikram Nair, aye. Mr. Patrick Tay, absent. Dr. Lim Wee Kiak, aye. Mr. Saktiandi Supaat, aye. Ms. He Ting Ru, no. Mr. Louis Chua, no. Ms. Haini So, aye. Dr. Wan Rizal, aye. Mr. Derek Goh, aye. Mr. Ang Wei Neng, aye. Mr. Dennis Tan, no. Mr. Muhammad Fahmi, absent. Mr. Melvin Yong, aye. Mr. Zulkarnain Abdul Rahim, aye. Ms. Carrie Tan, aye. Ms. Ng Ling Ling, aye. Associate Professor Hun Hian Teck, aye. Ms. Janet Ang, aye. Ms. Mariam Jaffa, aye. Mr. Sean Huang, aye. Ms. Po Lee San, aye. Ms. Yo Wan Ling, aye. Mr. Xie Yao Chuan, aye. Mr. Edward Chia, aye. Mr. Cheng Sing Yao, absent. Mr. Shaira Taha, aye. Ms. Raisa Khan, no. Mr. Leon Pereira, no. Mr. Henry Kwek, aye. Ms. Cheng Li Hui, aye. Ms. Sylvia Lim, no. Mr. Gan Tiampo, absent. Ms. Fu Mi Ha, aye. Mr. Chong Ki Hyong, aye. Mr. Jao Giam, no. Ms. Rachel Ong, aye. Ms. Nadia Ahmad Samdin, aye. Mr. Yip Hon Wing, aye. Mr. Don Wee, aye. Associate Professor James Lim, no. Mr. Raj Joshua Thomas, aye. Professor Ko Lian Pin, absent. Dr. Tanya Swam, abstain. Mr. Abdul Samad, aye. Ms. Hazel Phua, absent. Mr. Leong Man Wai, no. Mr. Mark Che, aye. Dr. Shahira Abdullah, abstain. Speaker time, aye.
You will call it the ayes and noes.
The clerk will now tally the votes.
Joel.
There are 75 ayes, 11 no, 2 abstentions. The ayes have it. The question is that the bill be now read a third time. As many as of the opinion say aye. Mr. Pritam Singh.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I'd like to call for a division.
Would you like to record your dissent?
Sir, I'd call for a division.
Will honourable members who support the division please rise in their places? Clerk, ring the division bells. Sergeant at Arms, lock the doors. The question is that the bill be now read a third time. Leader of the Opposition, you have claimed a division. Would you like to proceed with the division?
Yes, sir.
Take a division. The clerk will call the names of members to indicate their votes in the order based on the current seating arrangement. When called upon, members are to stand up and raise the vote cards in my direction to indicate their votes. The clerk will repeat each member's vote for confirmation. If the vote read is not according to their vote indication, members should inform me immediately to have their correct vote recorded. The clerk will now proceed to record the votes.
Mr. S. Iswaran, aye. Mr. Lawrence Wong, aye. Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, absent. Mr. Teo Chee Hian, absent. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, aye. Mr. K. Shanmugam, aye. Mr. Chan Chun Sing, aye. Mr. Masagos Zulkifli, aye. Mr. Ong Yi Kang, aye. Ms. Jessica Tan, aye. Ms. Sim Ann, aye. Dr. Amy Kaur, absent. Dr. Tan Si Leng, aye. Mr. Desmond Lee, absent. Ms. Lo Yen Ling, aye. Ms. Sun Xue Ling, aye. Ms. Gan Xiao Huang, aye. Dr. Tan Wu Meng, aye. Ms. Tin Pei Ling, aye. Mr. Liang Eng Hua, aye. Ms. Rahayu Mazam, aye. Mr. Tan Kiat Hao, aye. Mr. Bayam King, aye. Mr. Eric Chua, aye. Mr. Murali Pillay, aye. Mr. Sito Yipin, aye. Mr. Lim Biao Chuan, aye. Mr. Darrell David, aye. Ms. Joan Pereira, aye. Mr. Louis Ng, aye. Ms. Cheryl Chan, aye. Ms. Indrani Raja, aye. Mr. Gan Kim Yong, absent. Mr. Heng Swee Keat, aye. Mr. Pitam Singh, no. Mr. Taman Shanmugaratnam, absent. Dr. Ng Eng Hen, aye. Ms. Grace Fu, absent. Mrs. Josephine Teo, absent. Mr. Christopher D'Souza, aye. Mr. Chee Hong Tat, aye. Dr. Koh Po Kun, absent. Dr. Muhammad Maliki, aye. Mr. Edwin Tong, absent. Mr. Zaki Muhammad, aye. Mr. Heng Chi Hao, aye. Dr. Janil Puthucheary, aye. Mr. Desmond Chu, aye. Mr. Muhammad Faisal Abdul Manap, no. Ms. Denise Phua, aye. Mr. Desmond Tan, aye. Associate Professor Dr. Muhammad Faisal Ibrahim, aye. Mr. Elvin Tan, aye. Mr. Sia Kian Peng, aye. Mr. Alex Yam, aye. Mr. Vikram Nair, aye. Mr. Patrick Tay, absent. Dr. Lim Wee Kiak, aye. Mr. Saktiandi Supaat, aye. Ms. Herting Ru, no. Mr. Louis Chua, no. Ms. Haini So, aye. Dr. Wan Rizal, aye. Mr. Derek Goh, aye. Mr. Ang Wei Neng, aye. Mr. Dennis Tan, no. Mr. Muhammad Fahmi, absent. Mr. Melvin Yong, I. Mr. Zulkarnain Abdul Rahim. I. Ms. Carrie Tan. I. Ms. Ng Ling Ling. I. Associate Professor Hun Hien Teck. I. Ms. Janet Ang. I. Ms. Mariam Jaffa. I. Mr. Sean Huang. I. Ms. Po Lee San. I. Ms. Yo Wan Ling. I. Mr. Xie Yao Chuan. I. Mr. Edward Chia. I. Mr. Cheng Sing Yao. Absent. Mr. Sharil Taha. I. Ms. Raisa Khan. No. Mr. Leon Pereira. No. Mr. Henry Kwek. I. Ms. Cheng Li Hui. I. Ms. Sylvia Lim. No. Mr. Gian Tiam Po. Absent. Ms. Foo Mi Ha. I. Mr. Chong Ki Hyong. I. Mr. Gerald Giam. No. Ms. Rachel Ong. I. Ms. Nadia Ahmad Samdin. I. Mr. Yip Hon Wing. I. Mr. Don Wee. I. Associate Professor James Lim. No. Mr. Raj Joshua Thomas. I. Professor Ko Lian Pin. Absent. Dr. Tanya Swam. Abstain. Mr. Abdul Samad. I. Ms. Hazel Pua. Absent. Mr. Leong Man Wai. No. Mr. Mark Che. I. Dr. Shahira Abdullah. Abstain. Speaker Tan. I.
The clerk will now tally the votes. There are 75 ayes, 11 noes, 2 abstentions. The ayes have it. Leader.
Foreign Interference Countermeasures Bill.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that at its rising today, Parliament do stand adjourned to 11 a.m. tomorrow.
The question is that at its rising today, Parliament do stand adjourned to 11 a.m. tomorrow. As many as of the opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.